I dug up a time capsule, and we are all paying for the crimes of the past. By user/WineDarkC1239. The thing that called itself Richard Catesby emitted a rasping laugh. I misspoke, he said. You are no more my great-grandson than the King of England, but we've already gotten ahead of ourselves, haven't we? I'm not sure if this comes as a surprise to you, I said, but you died in 1940. Died? Perhaps. Death is a funny thing in the land of the Fae. But by the look on your face, I can see you have questions. See, you don't have any eyes. Oh, I see plenty, William. Too much even. The gift of sight, that's what he called it. The bastard. The vines sticking out of his gaping, empty eye sockets shuddered. You made a pact with him. You paid the price. The entire town paid the price. Ah, yes. Those fools in Druidge blame me for everything, don't they? With good reason, it seems. Perhaps you must see for yourself. What do you mean? Come closer. Let me touch you. Then you will see what I see. It was not a tantalizing offer, to say the least. No, I prefer seeing the normal way, thanks. You do not trust me, I know. Then do not trust my words, but trust what you will see before you. The sight does not lie. What you will see is no dream, but the truth of the past. He was right. I didn't trust him. But then again, what other way could I finally see the truth? I took a step closer and lowered my head towards the leaves that pushed through his rotten fingertips, trying to suppress the vomit that leapt up in my throat. The fingers twitched. Richard smiled. At the touch of his fingers, a wave of nausea passed through me. They smelled like decaying vegetables. The dark tunnel dissolved around me and I heard Richard's voice echoing from inside my head. The Catesbys were once the most prominent landowners in Druidge. Since the Middle Ages, they owned acres and acres of prosperous farmland. Our fortune steadily increased. Our children married the daughters of barons. My own mother, the Honorable Anne Quennell, was the daughter of a viscount. My elder brother George was set to inherit a fine estate, but then my father threw it all away. My father was a gambler, you see. A nasty, foolish, degenerate gambler. The farm disappeared, acre by acre ceded to creditors. Our stately home was sold, our possessions scattered to the four winds. My mother's jewelry, the pride of her ancient family, exchanged for paste copies until those too were pawned for the metal. By the time the Great War came, we had nothing except Catesby House, a meager shadow of our former grandeur. Suddenly, I was standing on muddy earth scarred by trenches and pockmarked with craters from shelling. It was a hot night, heavy with humidity and the smell of death. I saw Richard as a young man, in the uniform of the British Army in World War I, marching forward beside another man who could have been his twin. George and I signed up together. Anything to get out of that dreadful house, with my father reeking of booze and failure, my mother a shut-in too embarrassed to show her face in town. Little did we know it would be our doom. The landscape erupted into the staccato of machine gun fire coming from seemingly everywhere. The British soldiers ducked and dodged but continued to move forward. The head of Richard's brother flipped backwards, his hands shot to his neck as blood spurted. He let out a gurgled choke. Richard moved to help him, but he too was mowed down. Richard's leg had shattered. He could only just reach his brother, now deathly pale, touching his hand as he died. Richard's screams were drowned out by the shouts of other men, dying, wounded, trying to muster the strength to follow their orders. We were butchered, George and I. Though I escaped with my life, I came home with a pronounced limp, a wretched cripple. I hardly received a hero's welcome. I had to push aside a group of my father's creditors to even enter my own door. As I limped through Druidge, I felt their stares, their ridicule, their laughter at my misfortune. The Catesbys could not have fallen any lower, they whispered. The scene shifted and I saw the injured Richard walking the streets of Druidge, his cheeks burning with shame. The people around him not meeting his gaze, hurrying away from him with expressions of pity or mirth at his situation. Richard's shoulders tensed, his face hardened, and I could see that the bitterness calcified within him. My parents, of course, mourned George. They blamed me, I knew, as though I had somehow let him die. My mother called me lazy when I couldn't get any work because of my injury. I had loved a girl named Elizabeth from a fine Bearston family. She couldn't even bear to look at me. Richard reached Catesby House, but a rough-looking fellow blocked the door. Well, if it isn't Richard Catesby who shit his pants at the Somme. Step aside, please, Cole, Richard said quietly. Please, please, Cole, the man mocked. Do you have an appointment to wipe your mother's arse? To sop up your father's drool? Remind him he owes me 300 quid. Richard merely glared full of hatred. The man called Cole smirked and moved out of the way. Richard pushed past him and opened the door. He stood in the foyer, his chest heaving. Despite Cole's taunting, I had been no coward in the army. I had learned many things, but there was one skill I had mastered, one skill I had enjoyed, and that was killing. The scene around me shifted to a darkened room that I recognized by the four-poster bed to be inside Catesby House. A gray-haired man slept, his mouth agape, snoring loudly. The first one to pay was my ne'er-do-well father. A hand crept out from under the bed. Richard pulled out the rest of his body, the only sound a faint rustling from the fabric of his clothes. The moonlight filtered palely through the window, barely penetrating through the blackness, but illuminating Richard's teeth, grinning with a terrifying euphoria. He picked up an extra pillow at the side of his father's head. The man stirred. Richard brought down the pillow on his head, pressing down with such strength his knuckles turned white. The man's body convulsed on the bed. His hands rose blindly to find his attacker, but his struggle was futile. The body slackened soon enough. Richard let the pillow fall and, laughing quietly to himself, left the corpse to stare into the void with dead, bloodshot eyes. After my father's death, my mother kept to her room. Suspecting the truth, she shied away from me, observing me with fear and trepidation. I relished this. Her nagging was finally over. Eventually, she died. I found her a few days later. My father's creditors were next. It was all too easy. One by one, they met their end. The police didn't ask questions. They were all too relieved to have fewer loan sharks and criminals to pursue. But I saved the best for last. The man called Cole lay sprawled on a filthy cot, an empty bottle of gin beside him. It was another moonlit night, and he dozed in such a stupor that he didn't hear the footfalls of a man with a pronounced limp under his ground floor window, ajar for fresh air on a muggy evening. Richard deftly pulled the window up higher, slithering his body through the opening, a familiar stiletto gripped between his glimmering white teeth. He removed the knife and gripped it in his hand, approaching his sleeping victim carefully, the step-drag rhythm of his feet hardly audible. With near-surgical precision, he poised the stiletto above the flesh of the man's neck and ran it across, silent rivulets of blood bursting forth almost gracefully. As his last nemesis bled out before him, Richard observed an odd object in the man's nightstand. It was an iron horseshoe, unmarked and unused. Richard fingered it with curiosity and slid it into his coat pocket. I had finally removed the parasites from my family's accounts, but the damage was too severe. I still could not find employment. Elizabeth was still out of my reach. I was still a poor cripple who could barely keep a maid. But the horseshoe had awakened something from my memory. Old wives' tales the cook and scullery maids used to whisper to me as a child in the deep country. Tales of cunning men who had bargained for their heart's desire with the king under the barrows. Richard stood in the circle, before the barrows. He searched the woods around him, his impatience growing. "Show yourselves!" he shouted, voice tearing through the quiet. A murder of crows fled the tree closest to him. His eyes darted in that direction and widened with excitement. A tall, dark figure stepped out of the shadows, eyes burning with the same pale hue of the flames I had witnessed here in the world below. The face was handsome and cruel, its features pointed and elegant. He wore a gray robe of an unknown material. His smile was not quite the same as the smirks of the other Fae. It was measured, knowing, calm. "I would rather you not cause a disturbance, Mr. Catesby," he said, his voice cutting through me like ice. How do you know my name? Richard asked. He removed the horseshoe from his coat pocket. The Fae frowned. I see you found my old friend, Cole. He tried to cheat me, you see. Didn't want to uphold his end of the bargain, and took to collecting little pieces of bric-a-brac to ward me away. But a bargain once made is a bargain that will be fulfilled. And he paid. You made sure of that. I think you will find that Richard Catesby is no cheat. With whom do I have the pleasure of speaking? My name is mine and mine alone, but humans often find it convenient to call me Oberon, King of the Fairies. Would you give me what I desire, Oberon? That and more. I want endless riches, more wealth than any Catesby has had before. I want to marry Elizabeth Hammond of Bearston. I want her to love me, and I want my body to be whole. He shifted his injured leg with a grimace. Oberon looked bored. Is that all? How conventional. Can you do it or no? Richard shouted impatiently. Calm yourself. You have not yet heard my price. Name it, he hissed. It's very simple. I need a child. Richard laughed. I'm afraid I cannot help you with that. Allow me to clarify. In about 70 years or so, a child will be born to your family, but of my blood. When he has come of age, he must be returned to me. 70 years, you say? Why not 30, or 20, or 5? Richard, in spite of your all too ordinary requests of me, I have a special plan for you. Our pact will be no ordinary agreement. For centuries, my people have languished in weakness, reduced to haunting these woods. The pact we are to make requires a sacrifice to initiate. Any able-bodied youth will do. When you have made the sacrifice, you will break the bonds that imprison us. Our strength will increase. But such things take time. In the future, when your descendants bring me the child of my blood, he shall be the final piece, securing the freedom of our people to live and rule as they once did in the ages past. To make my deal, you want me to kill someone? Did you think such a bargain would be consummated with a mere handshake? Such a deed would come easy to a man like you. You are practically an expert. Richard smirked malevolently. And when I make the sacrifice, I receive what I have asked for? Of course. I will do it. He instructed me what to do and when to do it. The body had to be buried on my land, which at the time only consisted of the garden at Catesby House. I feared the neighbors would notice a mound of upturned soil in my yard, so I began to talk up the idea of a time capsule all over town. They laughed at me in that condescending way of theirs. Pathetic Richard. What's he going on about now? As for the price of my deal, what did it matter to me what happened 70 years in the future? I wouldn't be around to see it anyway. All that mattered was that I would get what I wanted. The wealth I deserved. The wife I deserved. The unfair ravages of war erased from my body. I made a decoy time capsule just in case anyone got curious. Inside, I placed items representing my reward. The royal wedding announcement of Elizabeth, the Duchess of York, and the football championship teams, symbolic of my renewed vigor and final victory over my foes. I played the horseshoe inside as a sign of trust in Oberon, that since I was now in league with him, I had nothing to fear. Oh, how foolish I was. Since my father died, I had scrounged a few coins to pay for a youth to hang around and do odd jobs. He thought himself mighty sophisticated, went around calling himself my valet. Too trusting he was. After all, by then I had had a great deal of practice in the fine art of killing. My old army stiletto did nicely. The only witness was an excitable maidservant who was easily cowed into silence. I admit I did not expect half the church to burn down, but it was a pleasant surprise. Seeing those smug smiles turning into wails made it all worth it. They did not even notice that I walked upright once more, that my leg had miraculously improved. It was as Oberon had said. Within a day of the sacrifice, Elizabeth was at my door, weeping and begging my forgiveness for her distance. We were married within the year, and eventually we had a son. I received word that a wealthy flour magnate in France was convinced that I had saved the life of his son in the war. The son had later succumbed to typhoid, but the father had tracked me down to bequeath me his entire fortune. I was wealthy again, more wealthy than I could have imagined. I never thought he would come for me so soon. It was All Hallows Eve, 1940. By then there was another war on, and across the country our nights were black. Not even a streetlight was permitted. My wife and son were sleeping. I was managing my accounts. I had dismissed the servants. Richard sat at the magnificent mahogany desk I recognized from Catesby House, squinting at a notebook, a lone flickering candle the only illumination. Outside the wind was howling, but there was another sound just beginning. At first only a low, guttural tone only audible between the lashings of wind. As the sound grew louder, it was apparent it was coming from under the window at Richard's right hand, just beyond the thick regulation blackout curtains. Richard cursed and glared at the direction of the noise. It began to travel back and forth along the outside of the house, a gnashing, slobbering sound accompanied by the scratching of what must have been great paws. Richard stood with a huff and grabbed a cricket bat leaning on the frame of the door. He flung it open and looked from side to side. His face turned a shade of ashen gray at the sight of the empty street lined with shuttered houses. He stepped outside, gripping the bat. He grumbled to himself about children and their unruly pets, failing to see a large black shape pressed against the side of the house. The red eyes and gleaming sharp teeth like beacons in the blackout. It snarled. Richard turned around, finally beholding the beast. It lunged towards him, its shape that of a giant hound, knocking him to the ground with great force. Richard thrust the cricket bat between his teeth just as it tried to bury them into his flesh. In the few seconds it took for the hound to destroy the bat, Richard had fled, running up the street, banging on doors and blackened windows, shouting and calling in a frenzy. But no one answered. Richard was no longer a young man. Before the ruined church, the beast caught up with him, catching his heel first, then pouncing, pinning his body to the ground. Then it began to feast. I thought I was dead. My body was almost entirely consumed by the black hound. But then I found myself in a dark, damp place, somehow still alive, or rather still existing. You see, Oberon was not content to let me die. I had always assumed that the future with which I had cursed my family would take place long after my soul had been annihilated. But no, the dog took my eyes, but Oberon gave me sight. He wove the ruin of my body into this monstrosity, and from here, I have been forced to observe the trials and travails of every Catesby since. At first it was a bit of a comfort, I admit. I thought the Fae King had taken pity on me. But do you know what it is like to watch your wife grow old without you? Watch your son also wither and die? Even if they all turned out to be such disappointments. But then there was my grandson, James, the man you called your father. That shameful, wretched coward unfortunately descended from me. I saw him meet your mother at university. He was utterly besotted with that beautiful, treacherous wench. Anger rose hot and strong within me at the mention of my mother. She betrayed him, betrayed us all. At first she hid the truth from my idiot grandson, but even she could no longer live a lie. My son Charles was the only one with some sense. I witnessed one more scene. It was the barrows again, the dead brown grass signifying winter. I was in my grandfather's arms, an infant not too much older from my beloved Christmas photo. My grandfather was upset. He placed me down inside the circle and wrapped me in a blanket, my blonde curls peeking out. I laughed and reached for him to pick me up again, baby hands opening and closing. My grandfather shook his head and backed away. Suddenly, there was shouting. A man came running into the clearing, eyes blazing with anger, panting. It was my father, James. "Have you gone mad?" James shouted. "You heard Miranda. He's not yours," my grandfather said with a sharp, bitter sadness. "He belongs to them." I began to cry. James rushed to me and picked me up. No, he belongs with his parents. I don't care whose blood he has. Whatever is between Miranda and I, it doesn't change the fact that I love him as though he were my own. You are fools to think you can escape him. One day the boy's time will come, and there will be nothing you can do to stop it, my grandfather said quietly. We're leaving, James said resolute. Don't bother to write. James took me away. My grandfather collapsed to the ground and wept. James was a pathetic cuckold, forgiving that harlot as soon as she asked. At least he had the decency to end his own miserable existence. I was back in the dark tunnel, soil beneath my hands, rage burning inside of me. Richard opened his mouth to spew more vitriol, and I threw myself at him, my hands making contact with the bones of his neck. At my touch, the vines multiplied, splitting through the remaining pieces of rancid flesh. Richard began to make sounds of panic, the leaves thrusting through his mouth, tearing apart its flapping tongue. Richard began to make sounds of panic, the leaves thrusting through his mouth, tearing apart his flapping tongue, pushing out the teeth. Finally, the plants had overcome him completely. The only pieces of him left were small fragments of white bone barely visible among the growth of splendidly colored foliage. His miserable existence finally snuffed out. I took a ragged breath, my body still shaking with fury, heart heavy with sorrow. The ground beneath my feet began to rumble. I stepped backwards and felt another putrid vine wrap itself around my wrist. Behind me, another corpse entombed by ropes of leaves had burst through the wall, its rotting jaw flapping at me with anguish. It pulled at my wrist, trying to pull me towards it, the stench overwhelming my nostrils. I struggled and broke away, retching. The rumbling only increased as the entire wall sprouted more and more of them, vines whipping out at me. Some cried out with the terrible moan of the tongueless. Others, still capable of words, begged me. Please, please end it, they rasped. I began to run. The corridor seemed endless, vines desperately trying to entangle me, only just failing until one managed to find my ankle. My body fell to the ground in a shock of pain as it dragged me towards it. I grabbed the vine and freed my ankle. I stood, and my eyes met the rotting holes of the corpse bound to the wall. It had no mouth or tongue to form words. A thin layer of skin remained on the face, pockmarked by plant growth. A vine lashed out and wrapped itself around my neck. I thrust out my hands, touching the remaining flesh, which shriveled underneath my fingers. The thing convulsed and, as with Richard, the plant life tore apart the remaining pieces of human inside it. The vine at my neck dropped. From behind it, I heard polite clapping. I turned around to find the king of the Fae, smiling at me indulgently. Now, you have had your fill of amusement. You and I are long due for a chat, my son.